I have absolutely no hesitation in saying I do not support the Black Lives Matter organisation.
Yeah.
Now, I don't like having threesomes because 90% of what you're saying is absolute.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's show. We have a special guest with us today, the legendary LBC presenter Iain. As you know, he's already been on the show once during the lockdown, but he's come back because he has a new book. Why can't we all just get along? So in this video we're going to discuss all the things in the book, from political tribalism to the intolerant left and the mainstream media. We've also managed to get Iain, we've got a couple of these books, managed to get him to sign these books so that we could do a giveaway for the members of the channel, because you guys have been supporting me. So if you're a member already, your name has already entered the competition. If not, you have until Monday to join. Check out the link in the description and become a member. And also don't forget to actually try and get Iain Dale's books in general, because you could find it in any shop or Amazon. It's a pretty good book, and it's going to be a long video, so grab a drink, get your snacks, and enjoy the show, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Today we have another special guest, Iain Dale.
Not that special, I've been on once before.
Actually, well, semi-special. Iain came on the show during the lockdown. It didn't really count. It was more of a casual thing, just talking about what was happening back then, and it was on Skype. It wasn't really like this. But we did talk about how you're going to have a new book, which is right here. And it's really interesting, because we just obviously finished reading it, me and my producer, on the show, because you talk about a number of areas, media, politics and issues, with the personal journey. Why did you actually decide to write this?
Well, the original idea, it was based on two ideas. Emily Maitlis wrote a book called Airhead, which I was never quite sure whether a blonde TV presenter should have a book called Airhead, but she does explain why. And it was essentially 40 chapters about different incidents in her broadcasting career. And I started reading and I thought, I could write this or write a similar book to it. So she would write about something and that would spark off a memory in my mind. So I started writing down chapter headings. And then I thought back to a piece that I wrote in the Mail on Sunday, New Year's 2018. And it was essentially as a response to the Queen's Christmas message. So I can actually say that Emily Maitlis and the Queen were the inspirations for this book, because it was all at the time, at the height of the Brexit rows. And everyone was falling out with everyone else. And it was a really horrible time. And the Queen basically said, why can't we all just get along? If we're all nicer to each other, we're going to have a much happier life. And it created quite a stir at the time, because she was actually saying something meaningful as opposed to some of her normal Christmas messages. So there's always some sort of meaning, I suppose. So it was really based on those two ideas. And I didn't want to write an autobiography. I mean, I'm not famous enough to write an autobiography, but there are various things that have happened in my life that I thought, well, actually, I think people would be interested in, particularly what I do on the media, some personal stuff as well. So I've tried. I wasn't sure it would work, if I'm honest. I thought, well, is this going to work? Sort of doing the media stuff, the personal stuff, and then the decline in public discourse, why that's happened. Would that pull together? And even when I'd finished the book, I still wasn't wholly sure that it worked. But so far, the response has been quite positive.
No, it has been great, because throughout the whole thing you talk about a number of issues, like, as we say, like media and politics, the state of this tribalism that's going on, the tension. You even talk about the NHS, the Extinction Rebellions stuff. One thing, before I actually get into the details of this, I remember when I had you as a guest the first time. When I usually have guests, with all respect to all the subscribers that I have, but also the other side, like someone like Owen Jones might have, a lot of times, if the guest or someone who has views, if they say things, even with conviction, it's the language that matters, the way they say it. So sometimes if I have a guest who might be more towards the left or a wet Tory, some people are just like, oh no, I just can't. Whereas someone like you, I read most of the comments, and a lot of people didn't fully agree
Always
with everything.
dangerous on YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. No, they didn't fully agree with everything you said, but they still respected it, and I think that's the biggest thing.
You're right that things have become incredibly tribal. In a way, things have always been a bit tribal. If you are a conservative and your party is under attack, you circle the wagon, similarly with the other side. But I do think over Brexit, it really got taken to an extreme. And we're seeing that starting again now, I think, with all of the free trade talks. And I did a phone in actually last night about where we were heading. And at the beginning I said, look, can we just not refight the referendum? I'm bored with that. It's gone. Let's look to the future. Whatever side you took in the referendum, surely we can all agree that we actually want the country to succeed. And it actually was a lot more positive than I thought it would be.
Yeah, you mentioned Brexit and this kind of the tribalist mentality, because it's not just Brexit Remain, even like with Labour and Conservative, the same thing, or in America with Democrats and Republican. There is a bit that I actually took a note. You mentioned there was a YouGov poll showing that 40% of Remainers would be upset if their child marries a Brexiteer, and then 11% of Brexiteers felt the same. 34% of Labour also felt the same, as opposed to 11% of the Tories. You did say something really interesting, that you said to be upset that your son-in-law is a Leave voting Conservative makes you zealot, not him.
Yeah, absolutely right. And even now, I don't think people who take that point of view understand it. If you look on Twitter, which is always a mistake, a lot of the Uber Remainers, they usually have hashtag FBPE in their tagline. They genuinely believe that anyone who voted Brexit was either stupid or racist. Well, I'm neither. At least I don't think I'm stupid. I mean, I'm sure I say stupid things from time to time, but they just think that they are morally superior to anybody else. And it's just not the case. You have to, if you're involved in a debate with somebody, you have to accept that they're entitled to have a different point of view to yourself. And if you are to marshal your own arguments, you have to understand the arguments of the other side. And I think that's one thing that 10 years doing speech radio has taught me. It's actually taught me that I can argue against somebody on anything at all, even if I don't know an awful lot about the subject. I can still sound as if I hopefully do know a little bit about it. But you've actually got to have a little bit of respect for the fact that the other person has a point of view. And that, I think, is disappearing in a lot of our public debate at the moment, and that's why people just feel free to insult each other all the time.
No, you're absolutely right. I think one point is I always at least try to be quite objective on this channel. Like, I even sometimes criticise. I do. Sometimes I criticise the Conservative side, the Brexit side, if we say something like nonsensical. But so it's good to have balance. There's both sides. Even this percentage that we had, at least 11% of Brexiteers felt the same. I get it. But you did also mention something about the tolerant liberal side actually not being tolerant anymore.
No, Suzanne Moore, who I quote in the book, which I wouldn't normally quote Suzanne Moore, but she went through a terrible time where she wrote something I think completely innocuous about trans people. And she said, well, I saw the face of the intolerant left there. It's not the Tories who are the nasty party, no. It's the left that can be equally as nasty. Let's face it, there are nasty people who, believe it or not, there are nasty Liberal Democrats. In fact, probably a bigger proportion of Liberal Democrats than maybe in Europe. Well, exactly. Believe me, I know. So, look, human beings are human beings, and human nature is to be imperfect. Yeah. And Twitter is a perfect example of that, where if you send a tweet to me saying, Iain Dale, you're a my natural human instinct is immediately to respond and say, well, you're a yeah, exactly. And then it escalates beyond that to God knows where. And this is something that you would never do in normal life. We would never encounter each other in the street and say these things.
Shout at people, no,
so it's sort of, I often say to people, you wouldn't say that to my face. But now I'm beginning to think that people do that. There was an anecdote in the book about that, where I was doing a talk on tax, believe it or not, in Adam Smith's ancestral sitting room in Edinburgh. Very sort of august building, being renovated to its former glories. And it was a very sort of Radio 4 type audience. I know 120 people there. And someone asked a question about Brexit. So I started my little spiel about, well, yes, I recognise that there are threats to certain sectors, but there are massive opportunities. And this guy in the front row started laughing. And I said to him, why are you laughing? And he said, because 90% of what you're saying is absolute shit. And there was a sort of collective intake of breath in the audience. And I said, well, that's very rude.
At least honest.
Thank you. You know, I am famous for walking out of interviews.
Oh, no,
and sort of the audience started to say, yes, that was very rude. And then a lady asked a question about the decline of public discourse. And I said, Well, he's a perfect example of that. I don't think even 5 years ago he would have said that in this kind of audience.
Yeah.
I said, but the great thing is he's given me my opening paragraph for the book. And the organisers were mortified and said, will you come back next year? Can we do a book launch for your book here? So I said, yes, please. And then, of course, intervened. So.
Oh, no. That's interesting. I mean, you did say that humans aren't perfect, and and also we tend to be, naturally speaking, tribalists to an extent. I think that you talk about identity politics to an extent and tribalism and all these different sides. I think it depends how much we control it. Because you did mention that, for example, you identify yourself as English first, British second, but also European, despite being a Brexiteer.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be black and white. But you even mentioned, I'm not a gay conservative, I'm a conservative, and I'm a man who also happens to be...
Well, look, people identify as different things. We like to belong to tribes. Football exists on tribes.
Exactly.
I'm a member of the West Ham United tribe. I hate Millwall. I hate Spurs. Hate is not a nice word, but I mean, that's just the way football works. I've always identified as being on the right, as a conservative. I sort of slightly don't identify as a conservative in the same way that I used to, because I'm not an activist. I don't campaign anymore, and I probably see more faults than now, and I call them out. But the interesting thing is, and I had this last night when I was talking about the free trade agreement. Oh, you're such a Tory party stooge. You're a sort of Boris Johnson and all the rest of it. And I said, well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because people always forget when I criticise the government, which I do reasonably regularly. I mean, the Gavin Williamson's fiasco over exams, the Dominic Cummings Barnard Castle thing. I don't hesitate to criticise them. Nobody ever remembers when I do that. They only ever remember when I conform to the stereotype that they think I represent.
That is true. I think this is the biggest problem we have, because firstly, I don't think you're like me. We're no longer big C conservative, at least not as members.
Well, I'm not even a small C conservative.
Yeah, because I'm a classical liberal, and
me too.
Yeah, and it's difficult to sell it though, because especially these days, because everything's so like black and white now.
Well, people don't understand that you can be right wing economically and be what you and I would term a classical liberal, but they don't understand what that means, because to them liberal means left wing.
Yeah, because of the media, because of everything.
But in terms of social issues, I do class myself as a social liberal.
Yeah.
So in many ways, I mean, I think I'm a proper liberal, and the Liberal Democrats have perverted the use of the word liberal, because they believe in a big state, they believe in lots of regulation, and they've forgotten what the word liberal means. And to my mind, the day that the Liberal Democrats are successful is the day that they can make them a party that I could vote for. I don't actually ever envisage that happening, partly because I don't think, even though Ed Davey is making noises now, slightly Eurosceptic, nobody's going to believe it.
No, it's not. And you're right. I think, firstly, Gladstone, if he were alive now, he would not be part of the Lib Dems. He would struggle.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, secondly, sometimes something like...
Bear in mind that he started off as a conservative.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's the thing. So you could say the same about like Robert Peel and everyone who could have, at some point, joined the Liberal Party with the Whigs.
But I did text Ed Davey the day he became...
I texted Gladstone. What?
That would be weird.
I DM'd him.
I texted Ed Davey the day he became leader, and I said, your mission, should you wish to accept it, is to make your party a party that I could vote for.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think I will live to see the day, but good luck to him.
No, you're right. It's difficult, because it's not really the leadership's fault. It's just there's a group of the... it is the leadership's fault to an extent. I mean, Nick Clegg, whatever people say about him now, actually was a very brave politician, a risk taker, and I think you do need to be a risk taker in politics. And he was a sort of more of an Orange Booker type liberal, my kind of Liberal Democrat in a way. But you look at both him and Layla Moran in the leadership contest, what they were saying about the trans issue, and you think you have lost it. You have lost touch with the British people if you think this issue is something that it should really be one of the main things that you're talking about. It is silly, and I think you're right. Actually, in terms of the certain issues that people are talking about, but also this whole left-right conservative liberal thing, doesn't help that it's the fault of not just the mainstream media but social media, how things have become so simplified. As you said, if you say liberal, people always assume you talk about the left. Especially in America, Democrats, liberal, socialists, whereas it's not really true. You did mention the book, the pros and cons of social media. Like you mentioned pros, obviously more accessibility in terms of spreading your news and communication. or the cons, the chaos, right?
Yeah, look, the internet has been a great force for democracy in many ways. It's given you a platform. I mean, you couldn't be doing this channel if the internet didn't exist. And of course, I grew up in a period when the internet did not exist. I can remember in my first or second year at university, this was in 1982, 83, long before you were even thought of, I'm sure, where I had to do a term-long seminar in computer-assisted language learning because I was teaching English as a foreign language as part of my degree. And we had to code a lesson in BBC Basic. Not a clue. Couldn't do it. Just couldn't do it. And I had to go to the teacher and say, look, can I write an extra essay instead because I just can't do this? And they were fine about it. But if you think about it, that is 35 years ago or so. There was no mobile phones in those days. No. We wrote all the essays. There was no computers. Some people typed them, but very few. I remember I did my dissertation in Germany, in German, on right-wing extremism amongst the German youth of today. 10,000 words, all typed on a German typewriter, which is the keys are in a slightly different place to a British one. So the technology in the 1980s wasn't there. And you think that, I mean, I think of my father, who was born in 1929, and think, well, he experienced so many radical changes during his life. He lived through the Second World War, then we had the technological revolution. But by the time I die, I think I will have experienced actually more than he did. I'm not, hopefully not go through a world war, but in terms of technology...
Then a no-deal Brexit coming.
Yeah, right. In terms of technology, I mean, who could have predicted where we would be now? And going back to the original point, when I started blogging in 2002, if you were just an ordinary member of the public, you had no platform. You could write a letter to a local newspaper and it might get published occasionally. When blog started, you had your opportunity to make yourself heard. Now, you might only have 30 people reading it, but that's 30 more than you had before. Then Twitter came along and essentially eclipsed blogging, because blogging... I mean, I had a website, but I had to get a webby person to update it because I didn't know how to do it. Yeah. But once I had a blog, I could do it all myself. Now, Twitter enabled people to do it even quicker than I could write a blog post. So you could literally, as any news broke, you could react to it instantly. And if you notice that when a celebrity dies, there'll be all sorts of newspapers or whatever on their websites. They will put the tweets of other famous people. Yeah. And so the trick there is to get in first. If you want to be mentioned in an article, not that I ever would, obviously, because that would be really bad taste. But I've noticed that if a politician dies and I comment on it, almost automatically goes in one of these articles. So it is a force for good in the sense that it gives people a voice, but it also gives evil people a voice.
Well, chaos happens. Yeah.
And that is the problem. And I do blame particularly Twitter, because they don't seem to be able to police it properly. They could actually stop all of these bot accounts if they really wanted to, but they choose not to. And it's got to the point where if I didn't have to be on Twitter for what I do, and it is absolutely vital to what I do, I might stay on it and just look at it, but I'm not sure I would participate in it, and that's really sad.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the downside and negative side of the social media, and also especially Twitter. But on the other hand, it has obviously created a new world when it comes to media. And do you think that one of the reasons that the mainstream media are getting criticized a lot now, and when people say biased media and all that, my view is not that they are always necessarily biased in terms of what they say, but it's the way they control the narrative, the panels, and sometimes they manage the shows. Do you think it's partly because they're just not used to this new world, because the competition in social media, of the YouTube and podcasts and everything, and they're just kind of outdated now? They haven't actually joined, because they're trying their best, obviously. I
think it's very difficult for newspapers, actually, more than broadcast organisations, because newspapers aren't going to die out. I mean, they really are. Yeah. Probably within the next 15 years, there might be only 2 newspapers left as print newspapers. Broadcast media, I think, is playing catch up in a way. For the BBC, it's really difficult, because traditionally they can't allow opinionated journalism or activist journalism. Well, they certainly can't allow it on the right.
Yeah.
But
you do it secretly, quietly.
And here we go. They do tend to be able to justify it on the left, where they'll they'll introduce people like Ash Sarkar as a journalist.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know if she self-describes as a journalist or not. There are journalistic aspects to what she does, I suppose, but she's not a journalist in the traditional meaning of the word. And I never describe myself as a journalist. If I'm on the radio and there's a breaking news story, I revert to sort of BBC journalism mode. I'm not a trained journalist, but I kind of know what to do. And you won't get an opinion out of me in that scenario. But on my radio station, LBC, the presenters are paid to be opinionated.
Sure.
And we offer opinions and then challenge our listeners to come and challenge us. And that makes for good radio. Now on the BBC, it's more difficult because if Nicky Campbell does a phone in, he's got to play devil's advocate with each caller, but it's a bit of on the one hand this and on the one hand that.
Yeah.
And he does it very successfully in that I don't know how he votes. Most BBC presenters and journalists, I don't have a clue. But that makes it more difficult when there are some who we have a very good idea of how they vote. And I think that's a real challenge for the BBC, and I'm not sure it's one that is easily soluble.
Yeah, now that reminds me, if Lewis Scuttle's watching this, hi Lewis.
You see, he's an interesting... I knew you were going to say that. I actually have a lot of time for him. I think he's a really top-class journalist. But...
We're going to lose subscribers here, but
if you look at some of the stories he's broken and some of the analysis he does, absolutely spot on. But it's because of his Twitter presence that people really have a go at him. Because somebody was a Labour activist at university does not mean that they can't be a BBC journalist, in my view.
Technically speaking, you're right, because if one day I, were to join the mainstream media, the BBC or something, I can't say too much right now about people like that, because then I used to be a Tory member, so I get it completely. I agree. It's just but the BBC stuff is quite different because it's not just Ofcom, but they have the charter, right? But then you've got other channels. You got the ITV, Good Morning Britain, and other shows as well, Jeremy Wine. And you've had experiences sometimes. You were on Good Morning Britain once in the middle of two lefties, and it's funny because usually people say when the right wingers on panels get kind of pressured or grilled, it's because they're people like Nigel Farage or like they're fiery, so they're like they want to bring him down. But they know, because the people who work there, they know you quite well. You're one of the nicest people. You're not fiery in that sense. You're not really going to shout
I can
crazy
be.
Oh yeah, when you're angry.
I bloody can be.
But so for those of you who actually haven't seen it, what happened there?
Well, I usually do this slot. It's Friday morning at sort of 6:30 or 7 o'clock, depending on how late they're running. And it's usually me and Jackie Smith.
Yeah.
And she and I built up quite a good relationship. I mean, I've classed her now as quite a close friend. And we do this podcast together for the many each week, which has built up a really big listenership. And people like it because we are opposite politics, but we get on, we have a laugh, and we just sort of provide some commentary on the week's events. And so we started doing Good Morning Britain, and they then said, would you do it every week? So, I have to say, I do not like getting up that early in the morning. But the reason I do that, and the reason I do Jeremy Vine and one or two other programmes, is because it introduces me to a whole new demographic of people that don't necessarily listen to LBC. So if they like what they see on Good Morning Britain, they then come and listen to me on LBC. So it's all about sort of getting bigger radio audiences. So, but sometimes Jackie isn't available or I'm not available, so they bring in other people. And on this particular day, they booked Grace Blakely, who I'm not going to say I discovered her, but I really helped give her a leg up in the media because she came on my show once and I thought, wow, you're really good. I disagree with everything you say, but you're a good commentator. So I introduced her to the Andrew Marr show, to Good Morning Britain and one or two others. And she then rapidly built a profile. All good so far. So this morning, we were going to be on together, just the two of us. But they'd had some up earlier in the programme, and Nihal from Radio 5 Live was supposed to be doing something else, but it didn't happen. So they said they would slot him in with me and Grace. Now, I don't like having threesomes on television.
Radio's fine.
Because it never works. It really doesn't. Let this be a lesson to you.
You work in other places?
Well, let this be a lesson to you.
What did I do?
And they said, we want to talk about the guy that's who's been found guilty of throwing this 6-year-old off a balcony in the Tate. And I knew vaguely something about the story, but that was really all. And they got some report that they'd been playing. So they then go to Grace, first of all, and say, why do you think this happened? And she said, well, it's because of austerity. And she spent, I think, 1 minute and 10 seconds blaming the government for the fact that this man, or this youth, had thrown this child off the balcony. And I just sat there thinking, am I really listening to this? Is it the government's fault that some... Anyway, so she finished, so they come to me. So I managed to get out a whole 9 seconds before she interrupts me. Because I said, I'm sorry, with respect, you're talking nonsense. How you can blame the government for this, I do not know. So she starts interrupting me. I get another few seconds out, then he starts interrupting me. And so it goes on, a complete pincer movement, which is typical of the left. When they don't like an argument, they try and shut it down. And I genuinely don't know whether I was in a bad mood anyway, or whether I just thought, I'm out of here. This is just ridiculous. I've got better things to do than spend the next 15 minutes with these two trying to shut me down all the time. So I took off my microphone, which actually I didn't need to do because it wasn't sort of fixed anywhere. And as I was getting up, I remember thinking to myself, is this such a good idea? But of course, by the time you've got up, you can't really sit down again.
Was it like Lloyd Russell Moore when he went to Parliament and picked up?
Yeah, exactly. So I walked out. Now the narrative has it that I threw a hissy fit and flounced out. I did nothing of the sort. I was very calm when I walked out. And anyway, I went and got my coat and bag from the green room and sort of walked out to the waiting cab. And the producer sort of ran after me and said, I'm so sorry, because, I mean, really the presenter should have intervened. Of
course,
And they both texted me, because I think I texted them, or did they text me for that? I can't remember. But I said, look, if you don't want me to come on the show again, quite understand, really sorry it happened, but I have my limits. And they both apologised. I mean, Ben Shepherd and Kate Calloway both apologised. And then afterwards, it got worse, because I was then driving to Norfolk. So I just tweeted that, well, everyone has their breaking point, that was mine, and just sort of left it, didn't look at Twitter for the next 2.5 hours. And when I did, I was actually quite pleased that about 90% of the tweets were actually supporting me and saying, well, good on you for standing up. Standing up in terms of what I did. But as the day went on, that slightly changed. And whenever I hit the headlines for whatever reason, the left have a tactic which they think really upsets me, which is to tweet the video of my Brighton seafront incident 7 years ago. And I just simply block them all. I mean, I just laugh now because they've edited it to make it look far worse than it actually was. I mean, the narrative is I beat up a pensioner.
Yeah,
well, considering I didn't even throw a punch or a kick or anything,
put a boxing glove in your
all I did was pull this guy away from the camera by he had a rucksack on, by the straps of his rucksack, and he then turned around and tried to punch me, and the momentum of that didn't hit, but that we both fell over. I mean, it was comedy hour actually.
Yeah. It was quite fun. And the dog attacked him.
The dog attacked him. It didn't attack me at all. So that's what they do to try and get at me.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think one issue is, again, the post the GMB incidents, Twitter became tribal, as you said in the book as well. The first, people were like, oh, okay, interesting. But then people pick sides.
Yes.
If you're either left or right, you have to go.
Exactly.
If you're right, you have to go with pro Iain.
Yep.
If you're left, anti Iain. I think it's the biggest problem. I mean, it's difficult to put people in certain categories because you do obviously broadcasting, but radio primarily. But if we say Iain Dale is kind of part of the mainstream media, or mainstream in general, it's difficult because sometimes a lot of people in the mainstream media, even commentators, find it difficult to express views on things that are now dominated by the left. For example, Extinction Rebellions.
Yeah, I have no difficulty expressing views on
the
them.
NHS. Yeah, so I mean, because there's a massive section in this book about extinction. And one thing that I think you mentioned was 13 years ago, I think, you invited Greenpeace to do a debate on the whole kind of climate change stuff, and they refused because they said there's no need to debate. We won.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's really dangerous when someone assumes that they've won the debate, and yet there is a substantial number of people that even now, 13 years on, question. Well, they may not question climate change, but they will question whether man has made as much of a contribution to it as is said. Now, I think that is an entirely legitimate debate to have. But again, most of these people are on the left, and they try and shut down the argument on the basis that they've won it already. Well, I don't think that argument is shut. I think my views have evolved over time, and at that time I was probably much more of a climate skeptic than I am now. But I just don't like any debate being... I mean, there are debates that you have to shut. I mean, I'm not going to debate with a Holocaust denier. I'm just not. I mean, what is the point? But when they try and equate, when they call people climate change deniers, that really triggers me, because we know what they're doing there. We know that they're trying to associate people who are skeptical about climate change with Holocaust denial, and that is outrageous.
Or flat earthers. I mean, this I think is the biggest problem, because we've done it before, especially in the West, where during the 2000s and 90s, the kind of political system and the media essentially shut down the debate on immigration. And if you were to talk about it, then you can't. And eventually that built up and imploded. And whether it's right or wrong, whether it should be anti or pro, doesn't really matter. It's the same with climate change. I mean, in this topic, I think because the Extinction Rebellion side and certain people in the media and the political system have basically said, well, yeah, the argument's over. We are going to die in 10 years' time, and we're going to have to bring down the kind of carbon emissions to zero by 2025, apparently now.
And it is actually quite cruel, because you have 10, 11-year-old kids on television crying because they are convinced that they're not going to live to 20.
We've got 5 years left, apparently.
And the thing is, and I can't remember whether I put this in the book, but Charles Moore, in the third volume of his biography of Margaret Thatcher, he's got a whole chapter about her and climate change. And she was the first world leader to talk about it and was convinced by it. And I didn't realise the extent to which she tried to get things moving then. Now, I think she slightly changed her views on that over latter years. But this is not an issue which the right should have let the left dominate, to be honest, and they have.
Yeah, I think you're right. I've heard this before when people on the right say, oh, the left now dominated it, kind of like feminism, things like that. But I don't think it's the case that the right should have embraced it. The right should have just embraced the debate. Say, let's have the debate. And I think, because Margaret Thatcher, you're right, actually there's a video on YouTube about Margaret Thatcher's speech during the 88 or 89 about this, and there's nothing wrong. You don't have to be completely pro-extinction and think we're going to die in 10 years' time. And you don't have to completely be a denier either. There is a argument in the middle for everybody. We want clean air, we want clean water, we want good environment anyway.
But there are sensible environmentalists. Jonathan Porritt, for example. I can remember when I was probably 22, 23, doing a debate with him in Norwich when I was at university. The local Conservatives said, they've asked us to put up a Conservative to debate the environment. And like a fool, I said, okay, I'll do it. And he was so good. I was really impressed by him, partly because he knew that I wasn't particularly well versed in these issues and didn't go in for the kill as he could have done. And I interviewed him recently for my book club podcast. He's written a new book on climate change. And he gets that there are nuances to the argument. And I mean, you've read the book, you know the word nuance comes up an awful lot. And that's the unfortunate thing in most of these debates. Now, there is no nuance. It's black and white. There are no shades of grey. You are either on one side or the other. And if you're not on my side, that makes you an enemy.
You're right. Although, with the case of Extinction Rebellion, I think they are definitely damaging their own side more than any other radical movement.
Well, they're interesting because when they started, even I was sort of thinking, that they're quite good at this. They've adopted a very different approach to protests. And I thought Middle England is actually going to quite like them. And they did initially.
At the beginning,
But it soon went into, I mean, whether they were taken over by the hard left, these parasitical groups, as Rupert Reed, one of their spokespeople, has called them. I mean, he says they haven't taken them over, to be fair to him. But I think there's a lot of evidence that they have, and that some of the tactics that they're using now, I mean, for example, you prevent people from getting their morning newspaper. Do you think there's a single person in this country who thinks, oh, I know, I'll support Extinction Rebellion? Surely it is all about winning hearts and minds to your cause. That is not the way to do it.
Also, it's not 1885. People are going to be like, if I don't get my newspaper, I go on my phone to check the news. It's not like...
Well, but you see, that's their justification for it. They say, oh, well, you don't need a newspaper.
Know,
but if you're 85 years old and you love getting your Saturday newspaper because you're not on the internet, you're not And they're going to think, well, these people die soon anyway, so they don't really count.
Yeah.
But what an attitude.
It's bad, and I think the biggest issue you have is that the attitude that they've had. I think up to a point where, comparing to other radical movements right now, whether it's the BLM movement or other causes that's happening right now, I think Extinction are losing the respect of even these kind of centrist, elitist, metropolitan liberal media people. So because they are now an easier target. We had Priti Patel just announcing that she's ordered the police to just take them out. Well, not take them out, but like...
Good luck with that.
Yeah, I know, yeah, just like... because technically speaking, mass protests are still illegal.
Yeah, but we all know that the police nowadays just don't do that.
No.
Some of us might think they should take a bit of a... I mean, you look at the Black Lives Matter protests, where because of the time that we lived in then, they were some of the fringes of the protesters were allowed to do whatever they liked, and that should not have happened on British streets. And that is another good example of a movement that I think had a lot of goodwill towards it, but when people actually worked out what the organisation was rather than the movement, then they took a rather different view. And I have absolutely no hesitation in saying I do not support the Black Lives Matter organisation. I can support the concept, but I cannot support an organisation that wants to abolish or defund the police or believes in the destruction of capitalism. I'm not going to support that.
Well, that actually brings me to the last bit that I want to talk to about the book, because the battle of language, especially from the left. We're going to talk about the NHS and our NHS stuff, because the Black Lives Matter as a slogan, or there are all the other kind of slogans like compassion, or like what's the Jeremy Corbyn one, for the many, not the few, that sort of stuff. Obviously, if whoever goes out on the street and say Black Lives Matter, no one's going to say no, it doesn't. Like it's like saying people like babies. Well, yeah, babies are cute. Like no one's going to argue against it, the actual wording. You also not afraid of doing something that even a lot of conservatives don't really do, criticising the NHS, because it's accepted now. It's religion.
I wrote a short book about the NHS about 5 years ago called The NHS Things That Need to Be Said, and I said them, and it is...
How did the book do?
Well,
actually, surprisingly.
Not massive sales, I have to say, but that was mainly because there was no marketing of it. But I mean, I did it because I was invited, one of my listeners, who's a brain surgeon at a hospital in East London, invited me to do a lecture on the NHS. And I was in the middle of writing an email back saying, terribly sorry, hearty busy, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, do you know what though? I have got quite a lot of things to say. So I changed the email and said, yeah, delighted to. So I had to write a 45-minute lecture, which is effectively about 7,500 words, so not insubstantial. I'd never written a lecture before. So I went along and delivered it, and it was about 120 people there, doctors, nurses, admin staff, whoever. And I thought I would be lynched because I was saying some pretty direct things. I wasn't advocating privatising the NHS, I never have, but there were lots of things that I've, not just because of my own family's experience, but many other reasons too. I just didn't feel that it was delivering what it set out to. And at the end of it, they all came up to me and said, you're absolutely right. I mean, from procurement to nursing staff to doctors, they were all saying, you're spot on. And that was really quite a light bulb moment for me. And since then, I do a lot on my program about mental health, and there's quite a lot in the book about that as well. And people think it's dramatic when I say this, but the NHS killed both my parents. So I'm going to have some fairly strong views, particularly about geriatric care.
Yeah, it's difficult. And I think I always find it kind of fascinating, but also frustrating when a group of doctors and nurses in a hospital or clinic do something good, obviously, people say, the NHS saved me.
Yeah.
And but when it goes wrong, obviously, it's Matt Hancock's fault, the government's fault. They killed me. But I think that's the problem, because it goes back to the language of left, our NHS. It's the brand. It's no longer... No one thanked the actual doctors anymore, or nurses. Apart from this clapping stuff that we had during the lockdown, when, they save your life, I would rather say that doctor and those nurses actually saved my life, or this hospital, rather than a logo. I think this again, tribalism that they've created, kind of like the whole...
Well, I don't know how you can love an inanimate object. I just don't. I mean, it's a bit sort of perverted in a way, isn't it?
People have fetishes.
Well, they do, but that's a strange one. I think we can all respect the work that the NHS as an institution does, because it does get a lot of things right. And I say this, but again, this is one of those things where nobody ever looks at the bits where I praise the NHS. It's always, oh, Iain Dale's a Tory, therefore he wants to abolish the NHS. I don't want to abolish the NHS. I want to make it better and actually provide the outcomes that other countries have got in certain areas.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I think, again, just like the environmental kind of topic, where if you criticise it, they say you're a denier. If you criticise the NHS, that they say you want to create one of the like American style kind of private whatever. In reality, we could still have a debate. You can't even have a debate. Sometimes I do on my channel and I say let's reform it, and I try to explain as well, like the areas that could be fixed, and look at certain countries, whether in Europe, Switzerland, also Singapore. Get the best out of all of them, create a better system. But people still, accuse you of like, oh, you just want to set it off to the Americans.
Yeah, that's all. That's the only mantra that the left have, and you can quote all the figures about the private percentage in the NHS, and it's gone up, I think, from 4 to 6%, and a lot of that was under Tony Blair. And you think, well, is that really privatising the NHS? I don't think so. I don't, frankly, give a stuff about structures. I don't really care whether it's a national health service or a regional health service or a local health service. All I care about is the outcomes. I want more people to get better. I want more people not to have to go into hospital. So all of the structures surely have to come from that, but it's the other way around now. We care more about structures than what the outcome of that is. And the NHS has become so massive now, and it isn't national. I mean, there are so many regional disparities. We've seen it in COVID, actually. You look at what's happening in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland and England and compare this is not a national health service. And there is a postcode lottery in virtually every aspect of the NHS. And let's not pretend that we don't have a lot of private sector involvement in the NHS. Anyway, dentistry, for example, pharmacies, GPs are actually in the private sector, but nobody quite realises that. So this whole public good, private bad argument is one of the most facile that you can have in politics. And I would love there to be, Anne Widdecombe, when she was Shadow Health Secretary 20 odd years ago, she was really the only one to actually grip this and say, look, it's fine to talk about a 21st century National Health Service, but if you've got a 1940s administrative structure, don't be surprised if you don't get the outcomes, because successive governments, they are afraid to carry out the reforms because they think they won't be able to carry the public with them. And I'm not sure I ever see that changing.
No, you're right. I think this is the whole point of the massive divide of you can't really debate anymore. And I think your book, it talks about all these other areas. Again, guys, make sure to actually get the books on Amazon and everywhere else. And one last thing before we finish, because the whole concept is, why can't we just get along? This nastiness that we've created. Is there a solution? Or?
That there is a solution, but it's up to individuals. It's not something that government can dictate. I think YouTube is not the worst. No. I mean, if you compare Instagram to Twitter, for example, I mean, I don't really do it. I do Instagram, but I've never quite got it.
Do you use filters?
I don't enjoy it as much as Twitter. But if Twitter could become a little bit more peaceful, and I do at the end of the book, I list 50 ways I think we can improve public discourse. And part of it is actually just all being a bit calmer, just taking a little time for reflection. Don't feel that you have to instantly respond to something that you disagree with. If you're intending to say something nasty, just wait 30 seconds and see if you still feel that after 30 seconds. And I think, it all sounds a bit sort of kumbaya, motherhood and apple pie, and a lot of it is very obvious. But when I got to the end of the book, I felt that I diagnosed a lot of the problems, but I didn't feel that I'd really come to hard and fast conclusions. So I sort of added that at the end. And I'm glad I did, because a lot of people had said, well, I sat down and read those 50 things, and I've actually I'd sat down and thought about the way I behave. And that's all I can do, is to try and make people think about their own behaviour on social media and the way that they interact with each other in political debates. And the evidence so far is that at least I have made some people think.
No, you're right. And I think I don't think the point of the book is or should be about you coming up with a solution. I think it's when you guys read it, it's about how you would reflect by just kind of reading all these stories, the personal stories. A bit of it which is quite emotional. Just I'm not gonna spoil it. Might have cried, but we'll see how it goes. But no, thanks again for coming on the show. And
really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Have you on soon again in the next book. Let's see.
Well, but you see, my agent keeps saying, "Have you written?" Because I've got 2 ideas, and they keep saying, "Have you written a proposal?" I say, I have no time. But I have got another one coming out in November on because it's the I've been doing sort of it concurrently with this. Yeah. The Office of Prime Minister is 300 years old next April, so it's 55 essays about 55 Prime Ministers. So it's an ideal Christmas present.
Absolutely brilliant. Perfect. Well, thanks for coming on the show. We'll see you guys soon.
Cheers.